and we are about to get to our final speaker here today. We have Professor Alvaro Cardenas, an Associate Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And he is the recipient of the NSF Career Award, the 2018 Faculty Excellence in Research Award from the Eric Johnson School of Engineering and Computer Science. He has also received the Best Paper Awards from the IEEE Smart Grid Communications Conference and the U.S. Army Research Conference. So this is our pleasure twice, Professor Cardenas, to have you here on this conference and to have you as the last speaker. So please, the stage is yours.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to give a talk in this week. Unfortunately, I always wanted to go in person. I think last year I was invited in person and I was so excited, and then the pandemic happened, but I'm glad to be back here for a virtual event. So I think I'm one of the last sessions, and I know in Israel you're past 7 p.m., like I guess 7:30, so I'll try to make it quick. So yeah, so my work is in I'm going to summarize a decade plus of research in CPS security, and in particular the relationships that we've been trying to build between control theory and information security. So cyber physical systems are basically, if you could sum them up in one image, they're basically the modernization of classical control systems with computer-based systems. So you can see in the left is like one of the first control systems, the steam governor in 1788. And on the right, you can see the modern car, which is basically, a computer on wheels. And cyber physical systems are basically, again, this modernization of our control systems with modern computing systems that, because they're computers, they can be reprogrammed to execute arbitrary logic, and at the same time, they provide new networking functionalities. So they are present in water systems, in autonomous or traffic systems, in the power grid, in medical devices. And you've probably heard some of the highest profile attacks like Stuxnet that was attacking centrifuges in Iran, or the power grids in Ukraine, that in 2015 there were manual attacks, and in 2016 there was a malware helping the attackers shut off the power grid. And attacks in control systems are on the rise. So so you've heard about Stuxnet in destroyers, Tridon in Saudi Arabia, cyber attacks in Germany, even smart meters have been attacked in Malta and in Puerto Rico, and even recently, like malicious insiders are always a threat. So an insider, an employee of an industrial control system who cost over 1 million in damages because I believe he was fired or something. So when we started working in this space in control systems back in 2007, it was hard to convince cybersecurity researchers that this was a problem. And at the time, in 2007, I mean, I just presented lots of attacks, but in 2007, the only, at least publicly known and verified attack which caused a problem in control systems was an attack that happened in 2000. It was an attack in Maroochydore in Queensland, Australia, where a contractor was basically hired to modernize a system, and then he was expected to be hired to the water system, but they didn't hire him. So he decided to go around with a radio and started sending malicious commands, so that in the hopes that they will hire him to fix it. And he ended up releasing more than 750,000 gallons of untreated sewage water in parks, rivers, hotel grounds, and caused loss of marine life. Public health jeopardized, 200,000 at the time in cleanup and monitoring costs. And so that was the only problem at that time, the only at least publicly known attack. And so we were trying to think back in 2007 when I had more hair, and I was working with my postdoc advisor, Shankar Sastry from UC Berkeley, and Sarab Amin, who was a PhD student at the time, and he's now a professor at MIT. We were trying to figure out what is it that makes control systems, the security of control systems unique, and what are the research problems that are different from classical computer security problems. So so the feedback that we got from a lot of security researchers was that for protecting control systems, there was nothing new. You just needed to use the traditional security tools, use proper crypto, proper authentication, proper software development life cycles, and that's the best we can do. And then control engineers, we were approaching them and we say, well, what happens if there's an attack in your system? And they say, well, that's not my job. That's the IT security guy's job, not mine. So what we focused on is the problem that eventually something is going to be compromised, right? So if you have if an attacker has partial control into a system, it has access a controller or a sensor or an actuator is going to be able to change the parameters of the system, and then you're going to damage the system. And then when we talk about it, the security people said, well, that's not my job. When you're dealing with control signals or sensor signals, that's the job of the control system. And then the controls engineers were saying, well, that's basically safety and fault tolerance is the same thing, right? So we've dealt with problems with sensors or controllers, and then we have safety systems that will prevent these things. But one of our main arguments was that attacks were different from failures. And we basically live into the very different worlds. So control theory tends to be a little bit like very mathematical, and they have their own venues like transactions of automatic control and the CDC, HSCC, things like that. And InfoSec community is more practitioner driven, more systems oriented. Outside of formal models and crypto, it is a little bit more practice, and it has less theory. Is more oriented towards practical implementations and things like that. So we were trying to bridge these two communities together at the beginning, and we were trying to say, well, our first goal is to try to write up a paper for control engineers, and another one targeting security experts, trying to motivate that security is not only about keeping attackers out, but also understanding risks, mitigating, detecting, and responding to adversaries that have partial control to our system. So, and the idea was to say that when you have an attacker that has this type of partial control in the system, we need to include practitioners need to know some control so that they can understand the risks, right? And they can also mitigate, detect, and respond to these attacks. So we published the first one in a CPS workshop, showing the need for control engineers to think adversarially, and then security experts trying to, in hot sauce workshop with Unix security, we published a workshop paper trying to explain to security experts why they needed to understand a little bit more control. And some of our early results, the first idea was published in a control conference, HSCC, and the idea was to show that attacks are different from faults, right? So, and the second idea we published in HSCCS, and basically was physics-based attack detection and response. So the first idea in a short overview was that secure control is different. Designing a secure controller or a resilient controller to attacks, a controller resilient to attacks is very different than designing a controller for safety and robustness. So there's been a lot of work in control systems for safety, for reliability, for robustness. And what we showed is that a lot of this previous work was insecure, right? We showed in particular the control over lossy networks, how an attacker could basically ruin state-of-the-art network control algorithms. And then we provide a secure control that had some limitations because it was basically more conservative. It was trying to remain closer to safe operation and without sort of like optimizing performance. but at the same time, it was more resilient to attacks. So that was sort of like, this is the first trade-off that we were discussing. And then the second idea was physics-based intrusion detection systems. And the idea is that if the attacker, for example, compromises this remote IO, and instead of sending the real height of the water in the tank, it changes it to a lower value, the controller or the PLC will keep thinking that the water level is low, and it will keep the valve on, and it might overflow the attack, right? And the idea to detect this type of attacks is through physics-based attack detection. So the idea is that if you have a detection mechanism here in the center that looks at what we're sending as a control command and what we're receiving from the sensor, we should be able to sort of like correlate my intention with what I get. And if there's any mismatch between both of them, we can say that there is something wrong. So yeah, we proposed this idea of physics-based attack detection using a famous control system problem, the Tennessee Eastman control problem of a chemical reactor plant. And we also studied the notion of stealthy attack. So even if the attacker knows there's a physics-based attack detection system, they will try to evade it and basically inject enough malicious data so that they try to bias the system, but they still remain under the radar. And we showed how, even when the attacker if the attacker tries to stay stealthy, it wouldn't be able to drive the system to some of these unsafe spaces. And there was also some early work from the security community. There was a lot of work, for example, on implantable medical devices and attacks on cars in 2008 and 2010. Then in 2011, there was like a famous paper on false data injection on the power grid. And in control systems, there was also some work on trying to work with integrity attacks, meaning when sensors or controllers are compromised. So yeah, I believe the last decade was a decade that was focusing a lot on CPS security, and from the information security community, there was a lot of early work was basically hacking stuff, showing that modern vehicles are vulnerable, medical devices are vulnerable, smart meters are vulnerable, or the power grid. And then some work on network security monitoring of industrial control systems, and we saw a lot of startups in that space. Actually, some of the more successful startups. I know some of them are in Israel, and then software assurance and minimal kernels for example, having drones. And then on a parallel world, control theory was working also on some of these security mechanisms. It was focusing a lot on physics-based attack detection, sort of like with passive, as I described it, and also active, which is similar to watermarking, where the actuator injects some random noise and then you try to see if the sensor sends back something similar to what the actuator is sending. And then some attack resilient estimation and control, consensus, safety, and game theoretic analysis of control systems. So the security and control lived happily ever after. We published a paper in CCS in 2016, and later on an ACM Computing Surveys journal paper trying to summarize the literature on CPS security, both from the control and security systems, on a variety of metrics, like, for example, what type of anomaly detection system were they using, what type of physical model were they using to represent the physical system, what type of metrics they were using to evaluate the success, where were they implementing them, where were they implementing these systems, and try to compare where like some of the differences lied. So, for example, control systems, they tended to use some statistics that some anomaly detection systems that were very simple, while in security, they try to do more complicated anomaly detection scores. And the reason control systems were doing sort of like this simple anomaly detection to things was because in control theory, you want to prove theorems, and whenever you put complicated statistics, then the proof become harder. Physics models, so in control systems, you tend to overwhelmingly use linear time invariant systems, where in security, it was all over the place. In metrics, again, it was all over the place. There's no agreed definition on what a good metric is, and some of the things that we tried to mitigate or to show in that paper in CCS 2016 was to propose a new metric to evaluate these systems. And then validation, again, it's all over the place in security, and most of the ones in control were in simulation. So we did some, mid-decade review, and we saw several problems. So are we better now? Are security and control systems a little bit better tied nowadays? And I think recently security conferences have become a little bit more receptive to papers that have control theory and power grid content. So for example, including some power grid details to understand the impact of attacks. I've seen, for example, the Kalman filter and the extended Kalman filter, which is the nonlinear version repeatedly used in papers that are published in some of the top security venues when they talk about unmanned vehicle security. And there's been also in the last year, I've seen several more papers using vehicle dynamics to detect attacks. So some of the sort of like the ongoing and recent work on, for example, showing how the security community is after a decade of research is becoming more receptive to more sort of like physical system details is for example, the attacks against IoT attacks. So the idea is that the question is if a high wattage IoT botnet can bring down the power grid. So the idea is, you're connecting all sorts of high powered electricity devices to the power grid, and that are connected also to your laptop, to your cell phone, like your electric car, electric heaters, AC systems. And if an attacker can compromise a large variety of these high-powered systems, it can potentially turn them on, for example, in a summer in Texas, or in a summer in I don't know, in Tel Aviv, where a lot of people are using AC. It turns on and it ramps up the power, the AC systems. Then it can potentially cause some problems in the power grid. So some previous paper, like for example, there was a paper published in Unix Security 2018 called Black IoT, and another one called Grid Shock in AXAC 2017, that they were saying, yes, these attacks are going to be problematic. But then in 2019, we worked with experts in power systems and cascading failures, and we showed that, not everything is dark and gloomy in these systems. So the power grid has several protections that are going to help against these attacks. Most importantly is the under frequency load shedding. So because at the end of the day, there's no false control or false sensor information. The power grid is seeing exactly what the system is behaving, and then if there's an increasing load, then if the protections of the power grid work correctly, then there shouldn't be any major problems or blackouts. I mean, there's going to be some load shedding, so maybe some brownouts, but it's not going to bring down what we call the interconnected power grid. Although we do have follow-up work that is going to be published this year in CCS 2021 on how to use these high wattage power systems to manipulate the market. So even though our argument is that even though they cannot bring down the power grid, they can still manipulate the market and make some profit out of it, because basically the attacker can predict the electricity consumption, and then you can make money out of that, but that's later on. Yeah, some of our recent work was also work focusing on autonomous vehicles, autonomous ground vehicles, or drones on aerial vehicles. And our idea was to implement and detailed nonlinear models of the physics of these systems. So we published this in Usonic Security 2020. And we implemented it in real world hardware, as we see here in these two prototype vehicles. And where we implemented the nonlinear equations, we estimated the parameters of these systems, and then we implemented them as a reference monitor to detect if, for example, if an attacker is sending false information to the camera, and I'm trying to turn, but I don't see that reflected in the camera, then I would, for example, I would check the physics of the system and detect that this doesn't correspond to my reality. And yeah, some of our recent work also tries to study the inherent trade-offs that there exist if you want to provide both privacy and security in cyber-physical systems. So this was published in NDSS 2020. So the idea was to there's a growing need for privacy. There's several stories, like, for example, if you use Waze, that hackers can stalk you, but at the same time, some of these systems are vulnerable to attacks. So there's been some examples of data poisoning in Waze, and in this figure we see how an artist used 99 phones to fake a Google Maps traffic jam. So he was basically walking with all these phones through a bridge, and then or through a town, I believe it was in Germany, and it showed how dynamically everyone thought there was a traffic jam where he was walking. So if we want to protect both privacy and security, there's going to be some trade-offs, and we discuss them there in this paper. And in general, if you're interested in more of this research and in CPS security, we also have a cyber-physical system security knowledge area from the SciBook, which summarizes a lot of these efforts and a lot of this work. So yeah, with that, I think I'm open to questions. And before I wanted to go, I wanted to show you some pictures of Santa Cruz, which I believe it's one of the most beautiful campuses here that I've been visited in the US. So if you're ever near the San Francisco Bay Area, or you're visiting Silicon Valley and you have some time to spare, let me know, and I'll be happy to host you or show you around. So yeah, with that, I'm open to questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Professor Cardenas. This is really a pleasure, and concluding with these pictures, this is really fighting very well our pictures here from Tel Aviv and Israel, hosting the conference. And unfortunately, because of the time, I cannot take questions at the moment, although I think this is a super important and interesting topic, and this is nice to see how the academy as well as the industry are trying to solve problems in the same domain, each one with the right methodologies and disciplines. So this is really great, and thank you so much for your presentation and lecture. I'm sure that people will join or try to connect you.